Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
Ever wish you had like a truth serum handy? You know, for those times when your coworker says they definitely sent that email. Or when your teenager swears they did their homework.
Yeah.
Well, today we are going deep into the world of interrogation and lie detection
Oh, interesting.
to give you some serious truth-seeking skills. So buckle up.
You might be surprised to learn that some of the most well-known interrogation techniques are actually, well, the least effective.
Yeah, like torture. Hollywood makes it seem like a surefire way to get information, but it turns out it's pretty much useless.
All right, torture is not only morally reprehensible,
Right.
but it very rarely yields accurate information. Take, for example, the enhanced interrogation techniques used after 9/11. Waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions. They inflicted immense suffering, but they didn't really produce reliable intelligence.
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable that the U.S. initially condemned those methods, even convicting Japanese war criminals for similar practices after World War II.
Right.
And then we turned around and...
It's a dark chapter in our history.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the importance of relying on ethical and psychologically sound methods for uncovering the truth.
Okay, so ditch the torture. Got it. What about something like the read technique?
Yeah.
That's what, like, a lot of law enforcement agencies use, right?
The read technique is a very widely used method, but it's also quite controversial.
Okay.
While it boasts a high success rate, reportedly up to 85%,
Wow.
there are concerns about its potential to lead to false confessions.
Oh, interesting.
We'll definitely circle back to that later because
Okay.
it's a crucial consideration.
Okay, so the read technique is one to approach with caution. But what I'm really curious about is how all this like high stakes interrogation stuff applies to, you know, normal life.
Yeah.
Like, how can I use these principles to figure out if my kid is actually sick or just trying to skip school?
That's where it gets really interesting. These techniques, while developed in intense settings, actually offer valuable insights into human behavior that we can apply to everyday situations. Think about, for example, Israeli airline Anisel's security personnel. They are trained to use behavioral analysis to spot potential threats.
Wow.
By paying attention to subtle cues and how people answer questions, they can uncover inconsistencies and hidden motives.
So it's not about becoming a master interrogator, but more like a master observer.
Exactly. It's about sharpening our observation skills and becoming more attuned to the subtle ways people communicate, both verbally and non-verbally.
Now, one thing I've always wondered about is, like, how good are we as humans at lying? Like, are we all secretly amazing liars, or are there tells that give us away?
Well, Fred Inbell, a pioneer in lie detection, argued that humans are incredibly good at lying. We've evolved to be excellent deceivers, and that skill has only become more refined over time.
So there's no Pinocchio's nose, no
Yeah.
single giveaway that screams liar, liar, pants on fire.
There's no magic bullet, unfortunately.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean we're helpless. By understanding the psychology of lying, we can learn to recognize subtle shifts in behavior that can provide valuable clues. Think of it as a mini lie detector that relies on observing changes rather than searching for specific cues.
Okay, so instead of looking for a smoking gun, we need to pay attention to the overall picture.
Exactly.
What kind of changes should we be looking for?
Well, imagine you're having a conversation with someone, and suddenly their voice gets higher or they start speaking much faster. Maybe they start blinking more frequently or they fidget and can't seem to sit still. These could all be signs that something is off.
It's almost like their body is betraying their words.
Exactly. It's like a polygraph, but instead of measuring physiological responses, we're observing outward behavior.
Okay.
We establish a baseline of their normal behavior and look for deviations from that.
Makes sense. So we've ditched the torture and embraced the power of observation. But what about some specific techniques? I'm ready to learn how to extract the truth like a pro.
Well, there's one technique called the reflex question that's particularly intriguing. The reflex question plays on our involuntary reactions to familiar stimuli. It's like Pavlov's dogs. But instead of drooling, we're looking for subtle changes in behavior.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example. Let's say I suspect my coworker of taking credit for my idea. How would I use a reflex question?
You could casually mention the idea in conversation, maybe even attributing it to someone else, and just see how your coworker reacts.
Okay.
Do they get defensive?
Mm.
Try to correct you? Their reaction might reveal more than their words.
Sneaky. I like it. What about behavioral control? That sounds kind of intense.
This one's all about observing self-awareness.
Okay.
Confident people tend to be outward focused, engaging with their surroundings.
Right.
But when someone's lying, they often become fixated on their own behavior, super aware of every move they make.
So if they're constantly adjusting their hair or clothes or overly concerned with how they're coming across, that could be a red flag.
It's certainly a point worth noting, especially when combined with other indicators. Now, if you really want to get someone talking, the funnel technique is a classic.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the funnel technique all about?
Imagine a funnel, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom.
Okay.
You start with broad, open-ended questions, encouraging free narration. Then you gradually narrow the focus, asking more specific questions, prompting them to elaborate, and potentially revealing inconsistencies in their story.
So you're basically easing them into a corner where their lies become harder to maintain.
Exactly. It's a subtle but effective way to expose the truth. And then there's the bait question, which is straight out of a spy thriller.
Ooh, that sounds good. Tell me more.
You introduce a fabricated detail or piece of evidence, something that doesn't actually exist, and watch their reaction. If they get flustered trying to explain it away, it suggests they have something to hide.
You're like, we found your fingerprints at the scene.
Exactly.
Even if there were no fingerprints.
Precisely. Their response will often reveal more than you'd expect. Another powerful technique is the alternative question.
Okay, what's that one all about?
Instead of directly asking if they did something, you offer two options, one more socially acceptable than the other. This gives them a way to partially confess without feeling directly confronted.
So instead of asking, did you eat the last cookie?
Right.
I'd say, did you finish the cookies or did someone else snag them?
Exactly. It allows them to save face while still emitting some level of involvement.
These techniques are fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like having a whole arsenal of truth-seeking weapons. The book also mentions fear up versus fear down approaches. What's the difference between those?
Fear up is the more aggressive tactic. It involves threats and intimidation to pressure someone into confessing. Fear down, on the other hand, focuses on building rapport and trust. It's like being the good cop, offering support and understanding to encourage cooperation.
So with fear down, you're trying to make them feel like you're on their side.
Exactly. You want to create a sense of safety and trust so they feel comfortable opening up to you. The book mentions a German interrogator during World War II, Hans Joachim Scharf, who was known for his non-coercive methods.
Interesting.
Instead of threats, he focused on building relationships with his subjects, often sharing meals and personal stories with them.
Wow, that's a completely different approach, and it worked.
It did. Scharf was incredibly successful at extracting information, even from high-ranking enemy officials. It highlights the power of empathy and connection in eliciting truthful information.
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive. You'd think that putting pressure on someone would be more effective.
But often, the opposite is true. When people feel threatened, they're more likely to shut down or become defensive. Creating a sense of trust and understanding can be much more powerful.
It's like that saying, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So we've got fear up and fear down. What about minimization and maximization? Those sound intriguing.
These techniques relate to how you present the severity of the situation. Minimization involves downplaying the consequences, making it seem like no big deal.
It's like, hey, everyone makes mistakes. Just tell us what happened and we can move on.
Exactly. You're trying to reduce their anxiety and make them feel more comfortable confessing. Maximization, on the other hand, is the opposite. You exaggerate the seriousness of the situation, making them feel the full weight of their actions.
Okay, so minimization is like a gentle nudge, while maximization is more of like a sledgehammer.
That's a good way to put it. The choice of technique depends on the situation and the individual you're dealing with. Now, all of these techniques tie into the crucial concept of understanding the subject's theme.
Theme. Fill me in.
The theme is the rationalization someone has created to justify their actions. It's the story they tell themselves to make their behavior acceptable, even if it's wrong.
So it's like their internal narrative, the way they make sense of their choices.
Exactly. And uncovering this theme is essential to getting them to confess. People often develop elaborate justifications, shifting blame to others, claiming they had no choice, or even arguing that their actions were for the greater good.
So if someone truly believes they were justified, they're less likely to feel remorse or admit wrongdoing.
Precisely. That's why it's so important to understand their internal logic. By addressing their theme directly, you can potentially dismantle their justifications and lead them toward the truth.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Techniques, themes, psychology.
We have.
It's a lot to process. But what about the interrogation environment itself? Does
Yeah.
that play a role in all of this?
Absolutely. The setting can have a huge impact on the outcome of an interrogation. Interrogation manuals often emphasize the importance of a controlled environment.
Right.
And there are some interesting parallels to everyday situations. Have you ever noticed how certain spaces just feel more conducive to honest conversation?
Totally. Like, sometimes a heart-to-heart in a cozy coffee shop feels more natural than a formal meeting in a sterile office.
That's the idea. The book suggests choosing a plain room, free of distractions, with comfortable seating and subdued lighting.
So no bright lights and cold metal chairs like in the movies.
Not necessarily. The key is to create a space that feels private and non-threatening, allowing the subject to relax and open up.
But I can also see how a more informal setting could be effective in some cases. Like going for a walk with someone or grabbing a coffee can create a sense of ease and connection.
You're right. It really depends on the situation and the individuals involved. Sometimes a more casual approach can foster trust and make people more willing to share sensitive information.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's all about reading the room and adapting your strategy accordingly.
Exactly. Now, speaking of adapting strategies, let's talk about some real-world examples where interrogation techniques were used in unexpected ways.
Okay, so we've talked about all these techniques, but like, are there real-world examples of this stuff actually working?
There are tons of fascinating cases where these principles were applied in unexpected ways. Take, for example, the story of Winston Churchill and the stolen silver fork. Supposedly, during a dinner at the Queen Mum's residence, a guest decided to pocket one of the heirloom forks.
Oh no. Did they call Scotland Yard?
The Queen Mum wanted to avoid a scene,
Right.
so she discreetly asked Churchill for advice. Instead of confronting the guest directly, Churchill came up with a brilliant plan. He slipped a knife and fork into his own pocket, casually strolled over to the guest, and with a wink said, "I think we've been spotted."
He made the guests think they were partners in crime.
Exactly. Then Churchill pulled the cutlery from his pocket, placed it on the table in front of the guest, and walked away.
Wow.
He gave the guest a graceful way to return the stolen fork without embarrassment.
That's genius. It shows how understanding human psychology can be more effective than brute force. Speaking of high-stakes situations, the book also talks about the interrogation of Adolf Eichmann, a high-ranking Nazi official responsible for orchestrating the Holocaust. That must have been intense.
Eichmann's interrogation, conducted by Israeli police captain Avner Less, is a masterclass in building rapport and extracting information from a very guarded subject. Less treated Eichmann with surprising courtesy and respect, creating an environment where he felt compelled to talk.
That seems counterintuitive, offering kindness to someone who committed such horrific acts.
It might seem strange,
Yeah.
but Less understood that to get Eichmann to cooperate, he needed to understand his motivations and worldview. He allowed Eichmann to explain his actions, positioning himself as a neutral listener rather than a judge.
And it worked, Eichmann confessed.
He did. Eichmann spoke at length about his role in the Holocaust, providing valuable historical documentation of the Nazi regime's atrocities. Liss's approach, while controversial, demonstrated the power of psychological tactics in eliciting information even from individuals who might seem impossible to crack.
It's a reminder that these techniques can be used for good or for evil, which is why it's so important to consider the ethical implications. But focusing on the positive, it seems like the core principles, building rapport, understanding someone's motivations, creating the right environment, those are valuable tools for anyone seeking truth and deeper understanding.
Absolutely. While the book focuses on interrogation in high-pressure situations, these principles can be applied to all sorts of everyday interactions. Whether you're a manager trying to get to the bottom of a workplace issue, a parent hoping to have a meaningful conversation with your teenager, or just someone who values authentic communication, these insights can be incredibly helpful.
So the takeaway isn't to become like a hardcore interrogator. It's about becoming a more perceptive and empathetic communicator.
That's a great way to put it. By understanding the psychology behind lie detection and interrogation, we can become more attuned to the signals people are sending us, both verbally and non-verbally.
Right.
This allows us to ask better questions, listen more effectively, and build stronger, more honest relationships.
But before we wrap up, I think we need to circle back to the potential downsides of these techniques, specifically the concern that methods like the read technique could lead to false confessions.
Right, that's a crucial point. While the read technique has a high reported success rate, it has been criticized for its reliance on psychological pressure, which, in some cases, can lead innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit.
So it's a powerful tool, but one that needs to be used responsibly and ethically.
Precisely. We must always be mindful of the potential consequences of our actions and ensure we're using these techniques in a way that respects the dignity and rights of others.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of interrogation and lie detection. We've explored the ineffectiveness of torture, the power of psychologically based methods, and the ethical considerations that come with seeking the truth.
It's been a great discussion.
If you are intrigued by this topic and want to learn more about how to uncover the truth in your everyday interactions, I highly recommend checking out Jack Nasher's book, Exposed: How to Get to the Whole Truth in Every Conversation. It's a thought-provoking read that will challenge your assumptions and empower you to become a more discerning judge of character. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, to seek out different perspectives, and to engage in thoughtful discussions about the complexities of human behavior. Who knows, maybe you'll even uncover some truths about yourself along the way.
That's the beauty of the journey.
And on that note, that wraps up our deep dive into the art of interrogation. Until next time.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.